What unfolded over Israeli airspace in the past 72 hours may ultimately be remembered not for the explosions that appeared on television screens, but for the silence that came before them. For 4 full hours, unmanned aerial vehicles reportedly operated inside one of the most heavily defended airspaces on Earth without triggering an effective response from systems that have long been presented as nearly impenetrable. That is the real significance of this event. The issue is not simply whether several drones struck their targets. The issue is that advanced air defense architecture built over decades, reinforced by billions of dollars in American and Israeli technology, appears to have struggled against a small number of low-cost aerial platforms flying slowly, quietly, and deliberately. In military terms, that changes the conversation entirely, because modern deterrence is built not only on firepower, but on confidence. Once confidence in detection systems begins to erode, every strategic calculation surrounding escalation, defense planning, and regional stability changes with it. The reports circulating among regional defense analysts described 6 unmanned aerial vehicles operating in circular flight patterns over metropolitan Tel Aviv for approximately 4 consecutive hours before Israeli defense systems fully recognized the threat. Whether every operational detail ultimately proves accurate is almost secondary to the broader implication now dominating military discussions across the region: the possibility that sophisticated integrated air defense systems possess exploitable vulnerabilities against slow, low-signature aerial threats. These were not hypersonic missiles crossing the sky in minutes. They were not massive saturation attacks involving hundreds of drones. According to the available accounts, they were relatively compact platforms flying at low altitude and modest speed, using flight profiles specifically designed to exploit the blind spots of systems optimized for entirely different categories of threats. That distinction matters enormously because it suggests a doctrinal problem rather than a single tactical failure. Israel's air defense architecture has long been regarded as one of the most advanced integrated networks in existence. The layered system combines Iron Dome for short-range rockets, David's Sling for medium-range interception, and Arrow systems for ballistic missile defense, all tied together through highly sophisticated radar, airborne surveillance, and command and control integration. American X-band radar systems, including the AN/TPY-2, are designed to detect extremely small objects at extraordinary distances. The entire network exists on the assumption that threats can be identified, tracked, prioritized, and intercepted before they reach critical infrastructure or populated areas. Yet the emerging concern among analysts is that this architecture was developed primarily to counter fast-moving aircraft, ballistic missiles, and conventional cruise missile threats, targets whose speed, altitude, and radar signatures fit the assumptions of Cold War and post-Cold War military planning. Small drones operating at low altitude, moving slowly enough to resemble environmental clutter or civilian air traffic, present a radically different challenge. That is where the technical discussion surrounding the Shahed 191 becomes strategically important. Iranian drone development over the past decade has focused heavily on reducing detectability rather than maximizing speed. Flying wing designs, composite materials, buried engines, minimized heat signatures, and reduced radar cross-sections all contribute to a platform specifically intended to exploit weaknesses in traditional radar filtering systems. A radar network designed to identify ballistic missiles or high-speed aircraft may deprioritize objects that appear too slow, too small, or too inconsistent with expected threat patterns. In effect, the attacker weaponizes the defender's own filtering logic. A system overwhelmed with environmental noise cannot treat every anomaly as a confirmed threat without exhausting operators and resources. That creates the possibility that a low-cost drone can survive not because the defense system is technologically primitive, but because it is technologically optimized for a different kind of war. Equally significant is the reported flight path itself. Rather than approaching from the east, where Israeli defenses are heavily concentrated due to long-standing concerns involving Syria, Iraq, and Iran, the drones allegedly approached from the Mediterranean corridor to the west. If accurate, that indicates not random experimentation, but careful operational planning informed by extensive surveillance and intelligence gathering. Identifying coverage gaps inside a multi-layered defense network requires either highly sophisticated electronic intelligence capabilities or exceptionally detailed analysis of radar positioning, patrol patterns, and response protocols. That possibility is deeply concerning for Israeli planners because it suggests the issue extends beyond a single platform or single attack. It implies a growing ability by adversaries to map and exploit the operational assumptions underlying the defense system itself. The most alarming dimension of the incident is not that ground radar may have struggled to detect the drones. It is the claim that airborne fighter patrols also failed to identify them during portions of the operation. Modern aircraft such as the F-35 possess extremely advanced radar and sensor fusion capabilities, specifically designed to identify difficult aerial targets. If overlapping layers of detection experience simultaneous difficulties tracking slow-moving, low-signature drones, then the event points toward a broader systemic vulnerability rather than an isolated radar oversight. This is precisely why military analysts in Washington, Brussels, and Gulf capitals are paying such close attention. The implications extend far beyond Israel. Similar problems have already emerged in other theaters, particularly in the Red Sea, where American and allied forces have repeatedly confronted challenges involving low-cost drone systems launched by non-state actors. What is now becoming increasingly clear is that the economics of modern warfare may be shifting in ways that favor inexpensive attritional systems over massively expensive defensive architectures. That economic imbalance is impossible to ignore. A stealth-capable drone costing tens of thousands of dollars can potentially force the activation of defensive systems worth millions per engagement. Interceptor missiles, radar operations, combat air patrols, electronic warfare coverage, and constant alert status impose enormous financial burdens over time. The strategic objective in these scenarios is not necessarily immediate battlefield destruction, it is exhaustion. If low-cost systems can repeatedly penetrate or pressure advanced defenses, the defending state is forced into a cycle of continuous expenditure simply to preserve deterrence credibility. Every interception becomes financially asymmetric. Every security gap demands additional spending. Over time, the conflict transforms from a purely military contest into a contest of sustainability and economic endurance. The geopolitical implications are equally profound because deterrence in the Middle East rests heavily on perception. Israel's defense systems are not merely weapons, they are psychological infrastructure. They reassure populations, stabilize markets, deter adversaries, and reinforce the strategic image of technological superiority. If adversaries demonstrate an ability to bypass or confuse those systems, even temporarily, the consequences ripple outward immediately. Gulf states begin reassessing their own vulnerabilities. Defense contractors face renewed scrutiny over existing doctrine. Regional actors adjust calculations about escalation thresholds. Insurance premiums for shipping and energy infrastructure rise. Oil markets incorporate higher geopolitical risk premiums. Investors react not only to actual damage, but to perceived instability. In that sense, 4 hours of undetected drone activity can reshape strategic behavior far beyond the immediate military event itself. And that is why this incident matters so much more than the explosions that eventually followed. The real revelation was not the payload, it was the proof, or at minimum the perception, that a relatively inexpensive, reproducible capability may now exist to challenge some of the most sophisticated air defense systems ever constructed. Once that perception enters the strategic environment, every government in the region must begin recalculating its assumptions about deterrence, escalation, and vulnerability. The battlefield is no longer defined solely by who possesses the most advanced hardware. Increasingly, it is defined by who can impose unsustainable costs on the other side, using systems cheap enough to deploy repeatedly and difficult enough to stop consistently. A single Iron Dome interceptor missile costs roughly between $50,000 and $100,000 per launch, depending on the engagement profile and support systems involved. That means, in some cases, the missile fired to destroy the drone costs as much as or more than the drone itself. But even that financial imbalance is not the core issue exposed by the events over Israeli airspace. The deeper problem is simpler and far more dangerous. You cannot intercept what you cannot reliably detect. And if radar systems built on decades of American technological development, billions in defense investment, and some of the most sophisticated integrated air defense architecture on Earth are struggling to consistently identify low-signature unmanned platforms, then the entire assumption of uncontested air defense superiority in the Middle East suddenly becomes negotiable rather than absolute. Think carefully about what that means strategically. When a regional adversary demonstrates the ability to operate inside heavily defended airspace for 4 consecutive hours, this is not merely a tactical embarrassment or an intelligence oversight. It is the exposure of a structural vulnerability. More importantly, it appears to be a vulnerability rooted not in operator incompetence or temporary technical malfunction, but in the very design assumptions underpinning modern air defense doctrine itself. For decades, American, Israeli, and NATO systems were optimized to counter fast-moving, high-signature threats: ballistic missiles, strike aircraft, cruise missiles, and conventional aerial assaults. The systems were built around speed, altitude, trajectory prediction, and radar visibility. What they were not built for was a generation of slow-moving, low-altitude, low radar cross-section drones specifically engineered to blend into environmental clutter and exploit the filtering logic of modern detection networks. That distinction matters because it limits the available solutions. American defense officials responded to the incident with carefully calibrated statements, reaffirming their commitment to Israeli security and promising additional support, expanded coordination, and improved defensive integration. But none of those assurances changed the underlying physics problem. Radar systems operate through signal discrimination, increase sensitivity too aggressively, and the system becomes overwhelmed with false positives: birds, weather formations, civilian aircraft, atmospheric interference, maritime reflections, random electronic noise. At a certain point, the network becomes operationally unusable because human operators can no longer distinguish meaningful threats from background clutter quickly enough to respond effectively. In other words, there is no simple software patch that suddenly makes low-signature drone warfare disappear. The vulnerability exists precisely because these drones are exploiting the threshold between detectable threat and ignorable noise. And this is where the conversation stops being purely military and becomes economic. If you operate a business exposed to Middle Eastern instability, if you manage supply chains dependent on predictable shipping costs, if you invest in energy markets, transportation, manufacturing, or logistics, then what happened in Israeli airspace is not some distant foreign policy event. It is a direct risk management issue. Because once markets believe that Iranian drone systems can repeatedly penetrate advanced Israeli defenses, deterrence calculations change immediately, escalation probabilities rise, insurance premiums increase, shipping routes are reassessed, strategic infrastructure suddenly requires additional layers of protection. Investors begin pricing in the possibility that previously secure facilities are no longer fully secure. Those effects cascade outward through the global economy with remarkable speed. We are already seeing the first stages of that reaction. Brent crude prices moved sharply upward in the aftermath of the incident, not because oil infrastructure was destroyed, but because markets interpreted the event as evidence of expanding regional vulnerability. Energy markets do not wait for certainty, they price probability. Once traders perceive a higher likelihood of sustained escalation involving Israel, Iran, Gulf shipping corridors, or energy infrastructure, the geopolitical risk premium expands almost immediately. And when energy prices rise, the consequences move through every layer of the global economic system. Freight costs increase, manufacturing expenses climb, agricultural transportation becomes more expensive, consumer prices rise quietly in the background. The effect eventually appears in household budgets thousands of miles away from the Middle East itself. A drone circling over Tel Aviv for 4 hours ultimately affects shipping contracts in Singapore, refinery planning in India, insurance underwriting in London, and grocery prices in cities far removed from the conflict. History repeatedly demonstrates how these dynamics unfold during prolonged strategic rivalries. The comparison to the Peloponnesian War is useful not because history repeats mechanically, but because the structural pattern is recognizable. Athens possessed naval superiority. Sparta possessed overwhelming land power. Each side believed its advantages guaranteed eventual victory. Instead, both exhausted themselves economically, politically, and socially through years of attritional conflict. And while they weakened one another, Persia, previously defeated and seemingly peripheral, quietly reinserted itself into the balance of power by financing influence rather than direct conquest. The parallel to the modern Middle East is striking. Israel maintains overwhelming conventional superiority, advanced air power, nuclear deterrence, and unmatched Western backing. Iran lacks those advantages but compensates through asymmetric capabilities, proxy networks, economic endurance strategies, and increasingly sophisticated low-cost drone warfare. Both sides believe they can outlast the other, but prolonged attrition rarely produces clean winners. That is where China enters the equation. While regional powers burn resources on escalation cycles, China continues expanding economic leverage through infrastructure investment, energy agreements, and long-term commercial integration under the Belt and Road Initiative. Beijing does not need to dominate the battlefield directly if it can become economically indispensable to every actor once exhaustion sets in. The longer regional instability persists, the more external powers capable of offering reconstruction capital, trade access, and diplomatic mediation increase their influence without firing a shot. In that sense, the real strategic contest may not ultimately be decided by drones over Tel Aviv or missiles over the Gulf, but by which external power emerges as the indispensable stabilizing force after the exhaustion phase begins. So where does that leave the region now? In reality, there are only a handful of plausible trajectories. One possibility is controlled escalation, periodic strikes, calibrated retaliation, and continued attempts by both sides to avoid crossing thresholds that would trigger full-scale regional war. Another possibility is prolonged economic attrition, in which neither side achieves decisive military victory, but both suffer mounting financial and political strain while external powers expand their leverage. The final possibility, and the one that concerns strategic planners most, is miscalculation. Because once deterrence credibility weakens and defense vulnerabilities become visible, the margin for error narrows dramatically. One failed interception, one strike interpreted differently than intended, one escalation cycle moving faster than diplomacy can contain, and the region could shift from managed confrontation into a conflict neither side originally intended to fight at full scale. What happens next can realistically be reduced to three broad strategic paths, and each of them carries consequences that extend far beyond Israel and Iran themselves. The first path is technological adaptation. In this scenario, Israel, backed heavily by the United States, accelerates development of entirely new detection architecture specifically designed for the era of low-signature drone warfare. Traditional radar systems alone would no longer be considered sufficient. Instead, defense planners would move toward layered detection ecosystems combining distributed acoustic sensors, electro-optical tracking systems, infrared surveillance, machine learning-assisted pattern recognition, passive signal interception, and artificial intelligence capable of distinguishing genuine threats from environmental clutter in real time. The objective would be to create an integrated network that does not rely exclusively on radar reflection as the primary indicator of danger. But this path is neither quick nor cheap. It would require years of development, massive infrastructure spending, and a fundamental rewrite of air defense doctrine that has been shaped for decades around Cold War assumptions about speed, altitude, and conventional aerial attack profiles. More importantly, there is no guarantee that the adaptation cycle can move faster than the offensive innovation cycle driving Iranian drone development. Every defensive breakthrough creates incentives for new offensive countermeasures. If Iran and its affiliated aerospace programs continue improving stealth shaping, thermal suppression, autonomous navigation, and electronic warfare integration, then the technological race becomes permanent rather than solvable. In that environment, the defender is trapped in a position where maintaining security requires continuously escalating expenditure, while the attacker retains the advantage of lower production costs and greater tactical flexibility. The second path is strategic deterrence recalibration, and this may ultimately prove the most dangerous because it shifts the conflict away from defensive confidence and toward offensive threat projection. Under this framework, Israel effectively accepts that perfect interception capability is no longer achievable. Instead of attempting to guarantee airtight defense, it doubles down on deterrence through retaliation. The message becomes straightforward. If low-cost drones can penetrate our defenses, then any attack on Israeli territory will trigger consequences directed at the infrastructure most vital to Iran's survival, nuclear facilities, oil export terminals, command centers, military production sites, energy grids, and strategic economic infrastructure. This is essentially Cold War logic translated into a regional Middle Eastern context. Stability no longer comes from the certainty of defense, it comes from the certainty of retaliation. That model can appear stable for long periods because both sides understand the potential cost of escalation. But the problem with deterrence systems built on mutual vulnerability is that they remain stable only as long as communication, restraint, and rational calculation hold simultaneously under pressure. History repeatedly demonstrates how fragile that assumption can become during periods of sustained tension. One misread signal, one failed interception, one strike interpreted as existential instead of symbolic, and escalation accelerates faster than diplomacy can contain it. Once states begin relying more heavily on offensive deterrence because defensive confidence is weakened, the margin for strategic error narrows dramatically. The danger is not merely conflict itself. The danger is conflict unfolding between actors who increasingly believe they cannot fully protect their own critical infrastructure from retaliation. The third path is the diplomatic off-ramp, and although it may sound the least dramatic, it is likely the most structurally difficult. This scenario would involve regional powers, potentially including China, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, and other intermediaries, attempting to broker a broader security framework aimed at reducing escalation incentives before deterrence failure produces open regional war. Such an arrangement would require buffer mechanisms, verification systems, deconfliction channels, maritime guarantees, and some form of understanding regarding drone operations, missile deployments, and strategic infrastructure targeting. It would also require outside powers, particularly the United States and China, to play more active stabilizing roles despite their competing geopolitical interests. The difficulty is that every side would need to accept outcomes it currently considers politically uncomfortable. Israel would need to acknowledge that total military invulnerability is unattainable. Iran would need to place limits on capabilities it views as essential deterrents against overwhelming conventional force. The United States would need to engage diplomatically with actors it often frames primarily through confrontation. Gulf states would need to balance security dependence on Washington with growing economic integration involving Beijing. None of these concessions are politically easy, particularly during a period when domestic audiences reward strength more readily than compromise. Yet the alternative to imperfect diplomacy may be a long-term escalation cycle that steadily increases the probability of catastrophic miscalculation. At the moment, the strategic indicators suggest movement closer to the second path than many public headlines fully acknowledge. The 4 hours of reported drone activity over Israeli airspace were not important simply because they exposed a tactical vulnerability. They were important because they demonstrated capability. Demonstrations alter strategic thinking more profoundly than rhetoric does. Watch carefully what Israeli leadership prioritizes in the coming weeks and months. Procurement requests directed toward Washington, discussions surrounding layered low-altitude detection systems, investments in electronic warfare expansion, changes in naval surveillance posture, and shifts in public language surrounding air defense readiness will all reveal far more about internal strategic assessments than official press conferences ever will. Governments rarely state openly when deterrence assumptions have weakened, but their spending patterns, operational priorities, and doctrinal adjustments reveal it indirectly. The larger questions now facing the region extend well beyond Israel and Iran alone. Can legacy air defense systems designed around Cold War assumptions adapt quickly enough to counter mass proliferation of inexpensive stealth-capable drones? What happens to regional stability when conventional military superiority no longer guarantees air defense superiority? And perhaps most importantly for Washington, what happens when American allies require continuously increasing security subsidies to maintain deterrence while the strategic return on those investments becomes progressively less certain? Those are not temporary battlefield questions. They are structural questions about the future of modern conflict itself. Because ultimately the significance of these events may not lie in the damage inflicted during any single operation. It may lie in the realization now spreading across military establishment worldwide that relatively inexpensive autonomous systems are beginning to challenge assumptions that have defined air power and deterrence for generations. If that realization proves accurate, then what occurred over Israeli airspace will not be remembered as an isolated incident. It will be remembered as an early signal of a much broader transformation in how regional wars are fought, how deterrence functions, and how power itself is projected in the 21st century.